Life in ancient Sparta, renowned for its strict discipline, was a rigorous test demanding unwavering resilience and absolute devotion to the state. For every boy born into this unique society, life was a continuous series of trials, beginning literally from his first day until his death. He was regarded as nothing less than a high-performance fighting machine, a reliable workhorse whose sole purpose and meaning of existence lay in an uncompromising fight for his homeland. When a Spartan was not engaged in battle, he tirelessly trained, honing his skills to be ready for the next fight. In essence, his entire upbringing was geared towards forging the ideal warrior. Such was Sparta. Control over a Spartan boy's life began almost from his very first breath. Soon after birth, the infant, barely having seen the light of day, was taken to the Gerousia, a council of the oldest and most respected Spartans, where he was subjected to a thorough inspection, much like a valuable but soulless piece of property. If, during this merciless examination, the infant appeared sick, weak, or mentally or physically impaired, he was deemed utterly useless to the Spartan army, and thus, to the state. While widespread legends claim that these rejected newborns were ruthlessly thrown into a chasm or left at the foot of the majestic Mount Taygetus, a more probable scenario was that they were simply left to perish in the wilderness or on nearby hills. Occasionally, though very rarely, these abandoned infants were accidentally found by locals and quietly taken in, granting them a chance at a different fate. However, in the vast majority of cases, they faced inevitable death from exposure, ending silently in the wild expanse. Male infants who successfully passed the Gerousia's rigorous inspection were deemed fit and returned to their families, where relentless preparation for a demanding and harsh life awaited them. These newborns were not bathed in ordinary water. Instead, they were immersed in baths filled with wine. There was a strong belief that such a ritual cleansing would strengthen their bodies and spirits, making them more resilient and steadfast against hardship. According to ancient belief, weaker infants would not survive such a test, convulsing and ultimately perishing. From the earliest age, these children were also methodically trained to overcome the fear of darkness and solitude. When they cried or expressed discontent, their parents and guardians deliberately ignored these displays of weakness to harden their will. This upbringing continued until the boys reached 7 years of age. Although marked by significant difficulties, a Spartan child's life during their first 6 years was nonetheless considered relatively favorable. Compared to how the state, to which they wholly belonged, began to treat them upon reaching 7 years old, these early years seemed almost the best. It was at this age that true, uncompromising military training began. At 7, every boy was enrolled in the agoge, a unique state-run education system under the strict supervision of a paedonomus. This Spartan term literally translates to herder of boys, and it designated a magistrate with immense responsibility for overseeing and guiding the training of future Spartan warriors. The agoge was meticulously structured and divided into 3 main age categories: paids, covering boys aged 7 to 17, paidiska, for youths aged 17 to 19, and hibantes, encompassing young men from 20 to 29 years old. Some historical sources even indicate the existence of smaller subdivisions within these classes, grouped by birth year. In the early stage of training, within the paids category, Spartan boys underwent an exceptionally intensive training regimen. Throughout this 10-year course, they were systematically transformed into fearless warriors, tirelessly taught vital survival tactics such as hand-to-hand combat, complex military strategy, and the art of hunting. Unlike Spartan men, women did not undergo an identical training system. Nevertheless, their education included dance, gymnastics, and javelin throwing, which aimed to cultivate strong, physically developed mothers. For it was upon Spartan women that the crucial task lay, to ensure the birth of the healthiest possible offspring who would become valiant warriors in the future. This was a responsibility of immense significance, not to be taken lightly. In the context of discussing the status of Spartan women, it is important to emphasize that they were widely known throughout ancient Greece for an unprecedented degree of freedom, unmatched by any other woman in the Hellenic world. To those living outside Sparta, Spartan women were often seen as free-thinking and assertive towards their husbands. They were independent individuals, largely beyond external control. Furthermore, Spartan women possessed the legal right to own and inherit property, a rarity for the time. As a rule, they also received a higher quality of education. And while the Spartan practice of infanticide for newborns deemed unhealthy is a historically confirmed fact, it remains a subject of debate whether this practice extended to newborn girls to the same extent as boys, although the testimony of the ancient Greek biographer Plutarch indirectly suggests otherwise. However, unlike boys, who were handed over to the state for military training, newborn girls apparently were immediately returned to their mothers. It was under the care of their mothers that these young girls underwent an upbringing based on a strict regimen of physical exercise and a balanced, nutritious diet, with the goal of raising them into physically developed women capable of bearing robust offspring. Regarding the aforementioned physical training regimen, Spartan girls were trained to achieve the same physical prowess as boys, who, in turn, were preparing for war, even though young girls did not participate in combat training. Instead, the physical training for Spartan girls included mastering skills such as proper horseback riding, running, wrestling, discus and javelin throwing, and undergoing various strength tests. Indeed, such an approach was entirely logical. Spartan warriors strictly abstained from excessive alcohol consumption, as intoxication would inevitably undermine the sole and primary purpose of their existence: devoted service to the Spartan army. Clearly, a drunken soldier could not be effective, becoming utterly unfit for duty. For this reason, Spartan children were taught from a very young age that severe intoxication was exclusively the lot of slaves. From time to time, Spartan warriors would intentionally force their slaves to become aggressively drunk. When fully intoxicated, the soldiers would parade these drunken slaves before local children so they could witness firsthand how pathetic and ridiculous a person losing self-control appeared. Thus, drunkenness was considered an unambiguous symbol of weakness and debauchery. Of course, warriors were permitted to drink a glass of wine with their meals, but the highest standards of the Spartan army demanded the strictest self-discipline. It is highly probable that those who indulged in immoderate drinking would not have survived the first serious battles. A Spartan's life, from the age of 7, meant being under constant, unwavering supervision. Regarding attire, each young warrior was issued only one garment per year, a single red cloak. This partly served as an effective method to prevent children from gaining excessive weight. If a boy gained too much weight and couldn't figure out how to make the issued clothing fit, the only way to get into it was to train actively and moderate his diet. Furthermore, these youths were deprived of footwear until they entered official military service. Children were forced to walk barefoot, even in snow, with a clear objective: to toughen their feet so that durable calluses would form, enabling them to cover significant distances in any, even the harshest, conditions. In dining halls, boys' rations were also deliberately reduced, serving portions slightly less than what was needed for full satiation. This fostered a lean, athletic physique, leaving them constantly experiencing mild hunger. Moreover, if any of them became fat, he was immediately ostracized and faced a serious risk of being expelled from the community. Although the daily life of young Spartans was characterized by harsh discipline, they were nonetheless permitted to marry. In fact, marriage was a constant occurrence, as this was how the necessary birth rate was maintained, ensuring a continuous influx of young boys for military training into the army. However, since men were entirely dedicated to the state and their military service, they were required to live in barracks. Only upon reaching the age of 30 were they allowed to reside elsewhere. Nevertheless, men who married earlier were forced to secretly leave the barracks at night to spend time with their loved ones. Naturally, if youths were caught attempting to sneak out of the barracks, they were punished with flogging, notably, not for the escape itself, but for being caught. It's worth noting that any punishment applied to these young men never served as a deterrent for committing the offense. Beatings were always applied because the men were not careful enough to avoid detection. Spartans were a very peculiar people. Unlike their counterparts in Athens, the inhabitants of Sparta showed no interest in philosophy, art, or anything beyond achieving perfection in martial prowess. Nevertheless, Spartans did pay attention to the education of their populace. Of course, this training primarily focused on mastering new strategies, physical conditioning and strengthening their mental fortitude for war. Young Spartan girls were not exempt from this type of military training, even if they did not have to serve in the army like their male counterparts. For Spartan youths, it was commonplace to endure systematic and arbitrary corporal punishment, or humiliation. This practice served to keep them constantly prepared and ensure their development into resilient and vigilant warriors. Military instructors even deliberately provoked rivalry among boys by arranging fights between them. This approach allowed for the identification of the least resilient and the establishment of the dominant in strength. As soon as a Spartan child showed signs of weakness, he immediately faced neglect and cruelty. Spartan boys were also deliberately restricted in food to encourage them to steal provisions for themselves. If caught, they were subjected to harsh punishments, however, not for the act of theft itself, but for their demonstrated inability to avoid detection and punishment for the theft. This strategy of food scarcity was also aimed at shaping unyielding, resilient warriors, in contrast to pampered and overweight individuals. Limited rations accustomed the youths to deprivation and hunger, which, in turn, served as prevention against difficulties related to hunger during future military campaigns. Ancient Sparta was not unfamiliar with social stratification. Indeed, a clear class hierarchy existed. And while the primary purpose of every Spartan was to serve in the armed forces, the societal structure functioned due to a strictly defined class system. The three main classes included the Spartiates, who held the highest position in society, followed by the Perioika, and finally, the Helots, who occupied the lowest rung of the social ladder. Spartan society was clearly structured, with the Spartiates, the true, indigenous inhabitants of Sparta, at its apex. These citizens, whose lineage traced back to the city's original founders, possessed full political and legal rights. They held the exclusive privilege of participating in state affairs. Spartiates not only served as the backbone of the army but also led it, and exercised comprehensive governance over Sparta. Essentially, the entirety of power and control rested in their hands. The next rung in this social hierarchy was occupied by the Perioikoi, who were often newcomers from other lands. This class comprised merchants and skilled blacksmiths whose abilities were vital to the state, as they produced weapons and armor for the Spartan army's needs. The Perioikoi were diligent taxpayers, possessed certain rights, including the ability to own land, and even had access to education that allowed them to learn to read and write. Like other segments of the population, the Perioikoi also had military obligations, but their role in the army was primarily supportive rather than combat-oriented. They were responsible for developing trade and maintaining relations with Sparta's neighboring states. It must be acknowledged that the lives of the Perioikoi, by the standards of the time, were not unduly unbearable. However, the lowest of the three social classes were the Helots, who performed the heaviest and dirtiest work, acting as servants and agricultural laborers. Make no mistake, Spartans harbored a deep animosity towards the Helots. The Helots' origin is linked to a region the Spartans called Hellos, located south of Sparta. With a rapidly growing population, Sparta actively expanded its territories until it reached the village of Hellos. As a result, the Spartans invaded this village, destroying some of its inhabitants and taking many captive. Over time, the Helots became slaves of Sparta, and although theoretically they had the opportunity to gain freedom by joining the army, in practice this brought little significant change. Even if granted freedom, a Helot continued to be treated in a manner unworthy of a human being. In fact, from time to time, there was a legalized practice in Sparta of killing any Helot, even if they were already free. This resembled a scenario from the movie, The Purge, where the government designates one day when citizens are permitted to commit any acts against each other. Thus, no Helot, regardless of their status, could ever feel safe. The existence of a numerous class of dependent servants, known as Helots, granted Spartan women unique freedom from the burdensome routine of most household chores. Those who had not yet experienced motherhood devoted their time to various entertainments and competitions, where their skill was evaluated in singing, graceful dances, throwing projectiles, wrestling, and many other athletic disciplines. Notably, ancient Spartan artworks and surviving drawings indicate that young maidens competed in these activities without concealing their bodies. Furthermore, It is believed that Spartan girls participated in the Gymnopedia, an annual festival where nude youths publicly displayed their outstanding athletic abilities and martial artistry through the performance of ritual military dances. This grand festival was established in 668 BC, coinciding with the official introduction of the aforementioned competitions where participants performed unclothed. Undoubtedly, a significant portion of these competitive events and athletic contests was organized with the aim of attracting the attention of Spartan men, highlighting the physical prowess and grace of the participants. However, beyond this obvious purpose, these achievements also served an important goal: preparing women for their future role as mothers capable of bearing and raising strong offspring.